Chapter 11 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kiki Bissell, Kikala.org. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home by Emily Post. Chapter 11. Invitations, Acceptances, and Regrets. The Formal Invitation. As an inheritance from the days when Mrs. Brown presented her compliments and begged that Mrs. Smith would do her the honor to take a dish of tea with her, we still, notwithstanding the present flagrant disregard of old-fashioned convention, send our formal invitations, acceptances, and regrets in the prescribed punctiliousness of the third person. All formal invitations, whether they are to be engraved or to be written by hand, and their acceptances and regrets, are invariably in the third person, and good usage permits for no deviation from this form. Wedding Invitations. The invitation to the ceremony is engraved on the front sheet of white notepaper. The smartest, at present, is that with a raised margin or plate mark. At the top of the sheet, the crest, if the family of the bride has the right to use one, is embossed without color. Otherwise, the invitation bears no device. The engraving may be in script, block, shaded block, or Old English. The invitation to the ceremony should always request the honor of your presence, and never the pleasure of your company. Honor is spelled in the old-fashioned way with a U instead of honor. Enclosed in 2 envelopes. 2 envelopes are never used except for wedding invitations or announcements. But wedding invitations and all accompanying cards are always enclosed first in an inner envelope that has no mucilage on the flap, and is superscribed Mr. and Mrs. Jameson Greatlake without address. This is enclosed in an outer envelope which is sealed and addressed Mr. and Mrs. Jameson Greatlake, 24 Michigan Avenue, Chicago. To those who are only asked to the church, no house invitation is enclosed. The Church Invitation. The proper form for an invitation to a church ceremony is Form number 1. Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Mary Catherine, to Mr. James Smarlington, on Tuesday, the 1st of November, at 12 o'clock, at St. John's Church, in the city of New York. Form number 2. Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith request the honor of Miss Pauline Towns' presence at the marriage of their daughter, Mary Catherine, to Mr. James Smarlington, on Tuesday, the 1st of November, at 12 o'clock, at St. John's Church. The size of the invitation is 5 1/8 inch wide by 5 3/8 inch deep. When the parents issue the invitations for a wedding at a house other than their own, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Littlehouse request the honor of blank presence at the marriage of their daughter, Betty, to Mr. Frederick Robinson, on Saturday, the 5th of November, at 4 o'clock, at the house of Mr. and Mrs. Sterlington, Tuxedo Park, New York, RSVP. No variation is permissible in the form of wedding invitation. Whether 50 guests are to be invited or 5,000, the paper, the engraving, and the wording, and the double envelope are precisely the same. Church Card of Admittance. In cities or wherever the general public is not to be admitted, a card about the size of a small visiting card is enclosed with the church invitation. Please present this card at St. John's Church on Tuesday, the 1st of November. Cards to reserved pews. To the family and very intimate friends who are to be seated in especially designated pews, please present this to an usher, pew number blank, on Tuesday, the 9th of May. Engraved pew cards are ordered only for very big weddings where 20 or more pews are to be reserved. The more usual custom, at all small and many big weddings, is for the mother of the bride and the mother of the bridegroom each to write on her personal visiting card, pew number 7, Mrs. John Huntington Smith, 4 West 36th Street. A card for the reserved enclosure but no special pew is often inscribed within the ribbons. Invitation to the house. The invitation to the breakfast or reception following the church ceremony is engraved on a card to match the paper of the church invitation and is the size of the latter after it is folded in the envelope. Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. James Greatlakes, company on Tuesday, the 1st of November, at half after 4 o'clock, at 4 West 36th Street, RSVP. Ceremony and reception invitation in one. Occasionally, especially for a country wedding, the invitation to the breakfast or the reception is added to the one to the ceremony. Mr. and Mrs. Alexander Chatterton request the honor of Mr. and Mrs. Worldleys presents at the marriage of their daughter, Hester, to Mr. James Town, Jr., on Tuesday, the 1st of June, at 3 o'clock, at St. John's Church, and afterwards at Sunnylawn, Ridgefield, RSVP. Or the invitation reads, at 12 o'clock at St. John's Church, and afterwards at breakfast at Sunnylawn. But afterwards to the reception at Sunnylawn is wrong. The invitation to a house wedding is precisely the same except that at Sunnylawn or at West 36th Street is put in place of at St. John's Church, and an invitation to stay on at the house, to which the guest is already invited, is not necessary. The train card. If the wedding is to be in the country, a train card is enclosed. A special train will leave Grand Central Station at 12:45 p.m., arriving at Ridgefield at 2:45. Returning, train will leave Ridgefield at 5:10 p.m., arriving New York at 7:02 p.m. Show this card at the gate. Invitation to reception and not to ceremony. It sometimes happens that the bride prefers none but her family at the ceremony and a big reception. This plan is chosen where the mother of the bride or other very near relative is an invalid. The ceremony may take place at a bedside, or it may be that the invalid can go down to the drawing room with only the immediate families, and is unequal to the presence of many people. Under these circumstances, the invitations to the breakfast or reception are sent on sheets of notepaper, like that used for church invitations, but the wording is, Mr. and Mrs. Grantham Jones request the pleasure of your company at the wedding breakfast of their daughter, Muriel, and Mr. Burlingame Ross, Jr., on Saturday, the 1st of November, at 1 o'clock, at East 36th Street. The favor of an answer is requested. The pleasure of your company is requested in this case, instead of the honor of your presence. The written wedding invitation. If a wedding is to be so small that no invitations are engraved, the notes of invitation should be personally written by the bride. Sally, dear, our wedding is to be on Thursday, the 10th, at 12:30, Christ Church, Chantry. Of course we want you and Jack and the children, and we want all of you to come afterwards to Aunt Mary's for a bite to eat and to wish us luck. Affectionately, Helen. Or, Dear Mrs. Kindhard, Dick and I are to be married at Christ Church, Chantry at noon on Thursday the 10th. We both want you and Mr. Kindhard to come to the church, and afterward for a very small breakfast at my aunt's, Mrs. Slade, at 2 Park Avenue, with much love from us both. Affectionately, Helen. Wedding announcements. If no general invitations were issued to the church, an announcement engraved on notepaper, like that of the invitation to the ceremony, is sent to the entire inviting list of both the bride and the groom's family. Mr. and Mrs. Maynard Baines have the honor to announce the marriage of their daughter, Priscilla, to Mr. Eben Hoyt Leeming, on Tuesday, the 26th of April, 1922, in the city of New York. The second marriage. Invitations. Invitations to the marriage of a widow, if she is very young, are sent in the name of her parents, exactly as were the invitations to her first wedding, excepting that her name, instead of being merely Priscilla, is now written Priscilla Barnes Leeming, thus. Mr. and Mrs. Maynard Baines request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Priscilla Barnes Leeming, to etc. Announcements for a young widow's marriage are also the same as for a first wedding. Mr. and Mrs. Maynard Baines have the honor to announce the marriage of their daughter, Priscilla Barnes Leaming, to Mr. Worthington Adams, etc. But the announcement of the marriage of a widow of maturer years is engraved on notepaper and reads, Mrs. Priscilla Barnes Leaming and Mr. Worthington Adams have the honor to announce their marriage on Monday, the 2nd of November, at Saratoga Springs, New York. Cards of address. If the bride and groom wish to inform their friends of their future address, especially in cities not covered by the social register, it is customary to enclose a card with the announcement, Mr. and Mrs. Worthington Adams will be at home after the 1st of December at 25 Alderney Place, or merely their visiting card with their new address in the lower right corner. Mr. and Mrs. Worthington Adams, 25 Alderney Place. Invitation to a wedding anniversary. For a wedding anniversary celebration, the year of the wedding and the present year are usually stamped across the top of an invitation. Sometimes the couple's initials are added. 1898 to 1922. Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Johnson request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Norman's company at the 25th anniversary of their marriage on Wednesday, the 1st of June, at 9 o'clock, 24 Austin Avenue, RSVP. Answering a wedding invitation. An invitation to the church only requires no answer whatsoever. An invitation to the reception or breakfast is answered on the first page of a sheet of notepaper, and though it is written by hand, the spacing of the words must be followed as though they were engraved. This is the form of acceptance. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Gilding, Jr. accept with pleasure Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith's kind invitation for Tuesday, the 1st of June. The regret reads, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Brown regret that they are unable to accept Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith's kind invitation for Tuesday, the 1st of June. Other formal invitations. All other formal invitations are engraved, never printed, on cards of thin white matte Bristol board, either plain or plate marked like those for wedding reception cards. Note paper, such as that used for wedding invitations, is occasionally but rarely preferred. Monograms, addresses, personal devices are not used on engraved invitations. The size of the card of invitation varies with personal preference from 4½ to 6 inches in width and from 3 to 4½ inches in height. The most graceful proportion is 3 units in height to 4 in width. The lettering is a matter of personal choice, but the plainer the design the better. Scrolls and ornate trimmings are bad taste always. Punctuation is used only after each letter of the RSVP and is absolutely correct to use small letters for the SVP. Capitals RSVP are permissible, but fastidious people prefer RSVP. Invitation to a ball. The word ball is never used excepting an invitation to a public one, or at least a semi-public one, such as may be given by a committee for a charity or a club, or an association of some sort. For example, the committee of the Greenwood Club requests the pleasure of your company at a ball, to be held in the Greenwood Clubhouse on the evening of November the 7th at 10 o'clock for the benefit of the Neighborhood Hospital. Tickets, $5. Invitations to a private ball, no matter whether the ball is to be given in a private house or whether the hostess has engaged an entire floor of the biggest hotel in the world, merely announce that Mr. and Mrs. Somebody will be at home, and the word dancing is added almost as though it were an afterthought in the lower left corner, the words at home being slightly larger than those of the rest of the invitation. When both at and home are written with a capital letter, this is the most punctilious and formal invitation that it is possible to send. It is engraved in script usually on a card of white Bristol board about 5½ inches wide and 3¾ of an inch high. Like the wedding invitation, it has an embossed crest without color or nothing. The precise form is Mr. and Mrs. Tithington de Peyster at home on Monday, the 3rd of January, at 10 o'clock, 1 East 50th Street, The favor of a response is requested, dancing. Or, Mr. and Mrs. Davis Jefferson, at home, on Monday, the 3rd of January, at 10 o'clock, Town and Country Club. Kindly send reply to 3 Mount Vernon Square, dancing. If preferred, the above invitations may be engraved in block or shaded block type. Ball for debutante daughter. Very occasionally an invitation is worded, Mr. and Mrs. Davis Jefferson, Miss Alice Jefferson, at home. If the daughter is a debutante and the ball is for her, but it is not strictly correct to have any names but those of the host and his wife above the words at home. The proper form of invitation when the ball is to be given for a debutante is as follows. Mr. and Mrs. De Peyster request the pleasure of Miss Rosalie Gray's company at the dance in honor of their daughter, Miss Alice De Peyster, on Monday evening, the 3rd of January, at 10 o'clock, 1 East 50th Street, RSVP. Or, Mr. and Mrs. Titherington De Peyster, Miss Alice De Peyster, request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Great Lakes, company on Monday evening, the 3rd of January, at 10 o'clock, 1 East 50th Street, dancing, RSVP. The form most often used by fashionable hostesses in New York and Newport is Mr. and Mrs. Gilding request the pleasure of blank, company at a small dance, on Monday, the 1st of January, at Fifth Avenue. Even if given for a debutante daughter, her name does not appear, and it is called a small dance, whether it is really small or big. The request for a reply is often omitted, since everyone is supposed to know that an answer is necessary. But if the dance, or dinner, or whatever the entertainment is to be, is given at one address and the hostess lives at another, both addresses are always given. Mr. and Mrs. Sidney Oldname request the pleasure of blank, company at a dance, on Monday evening, the 6th of January, at 10 o'clock, the Fitzcherry. Kindly send response to Brook Meadows, L.J. If the dance is given for a young friend who is not a relative, Mr. and Mrs. Oldname's invitations should request the pleasure of blank, company at a dance in honor of Miss Rosalie Gray. When and how one may ask for an invitation for a stranger. One may never ask for an invitation for oneself anywhere, and one may not ask for an invitation to a luncheon or a dinner for a stranger. But an invitation for any general entertainment may be asked for a stranger, especially for a house guest. Example: Dear Mrs. Worldly, a young cousin of mine, David Blakely, from Chicago, is staying with us. May Pauline take him to your dance on Friday? If it will be inconvenient for you to include him, please do not hesitate to say so frankly. Very sincerely yours, Carolyn Robinson Towne. Answer: Dear Mrs. Towne, I shall be delighted to have Pauline bring Mr. Blakely on the 10th. Sincerely yours, Edith Worldly. Or, a man may write for an invitation for a friend, but a very young girl should not ask for an invitation for a man or anyone, since it is more fitting that her mother ask for her. An older girl might say to Mrs. Worldly, My cousin is staying with us. May I bring him to your dance? Or, if she knows Mrs. Worldly very well, she might send a message by telephone. Miss Towne would like to know whether she may bring her cousin, Mr. Michigan, to Mrs. Worldly's dance. Card of general invitation. Invitations to important entertainments are nearly always especially engraved, so that nothing is written except the name of the person invited. But, for the hostess who entertains constantly, a card which is engraved in blank, so that it may serve for dinner, luncheon, dance, garden party, musical, or whatever she may care to give, is indispensable. The spacing of the model shown below, the proportion of the words, and the size of the card are especially good. Mrs. Stevens requests the pleasure of blank, company at blank, on blank, at blank o'clock, 2 Elm Place. The dinner invitation. The blank which may be used only for dinner. Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Jones request the pleasure of blank, company at dinner, on, blank, at 8 o'clock, 2000 Fifth Avenue. Invitations to receptions and teas. Invitations to receptions and teas differ from invitations to balls in that the cards on which they are engraved are usually somewhat smaller. The words "at home" with capital letters are changed to "will be at home" with small letters, and the time is not set at the hour. Also, except on very unusual occasions, a man's name does not appear. The name of the debutante for whom the tea is given is put under that of her mother, and sometimes under that of her sister or the bride of her brother. Mrs. James Town, Mrs. James Town, Jr., Miss Pauline Town will be at home on Tuesday the 8th of December from 4 until 6 o'clock, 2000 Fifth Avenue. Mr. Town's name would probably appear with that of his wife if he were an artist and the reception was given in his studio to view his pictures, or if a reception were given to meet a distinguished guest such as a bishop or governor, in which case, in the honor of the Right Reverend William Powell, or to meet His Excellency the Governor, is at the top of the invitation. The formal invitation which is written. When the formal invitation to dinner or lunch is written instead of engraved, note paper stamped with the house or personal device is used. The wording and spacing must follow the engraved models exactly. 350 Park Avenue. Mr. and Mrs. John Tenthouse request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Gilding, Jr.'s company at dinner on Tuesday, the 6th of December, at 8 o'clock. It must not be written 350 Park Avenue. Mr. and Mrs. Jane Tenthouse request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. James Town's company at dinner on Tuesday. The foregoing example has 4 faults. 1. Letters in the third person must follow the prescribed form. This does not. 2. The writing is crowded against the margin. 3. The telephone number should be used only for business and informal notes and letters. 4. The full name John should be used instead of the initial J. Mr. and Mrs. is better than Mr. ampersand Mrs. Recalling an invitation. If for illness or for other reason invitations have to be recalled, the following forms are correct. They are always printed instead of engraved, there being no time for engraving. Owing to sudden illness, Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith are obliged to recall their invitations for Tuesday, the 10th of June. The form used when the invitation is postponed. Mr. and Mrs. John Huntington Smith regret exceedingly that owing to the illness of Mrs. Smith, their dance is temporarily postponed. When a wedding is broken off after the invitations have been issued, Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Nottingham announce that the marriage of their daughter, Mary Catherine, and Mr. Gerald Atherton will not take place. Formal acceptance or regret. Acceptances or regrets are always written. An engraved form to be filled in is vulgar. Nothing could be in worse taste than to flaunt your popularity by announcing that it is impossible to answer your numerous invitations without the time-saving device of a printed blank. If you have a dozen or more invitations a day, if you have 100, hire a staff of secretaries if need be, but answer by hand. The formal acceptance to an invitation, whether it is to a dance, wedding breakfast, or a ball, is identical. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Lovejoy accept with pleasure Mr. and Mrs. Smith's kind invitation for dinner on Monday, the 10th of December, at 8 o'clock. The formula for regret. Mr. Clubwyn Doe regrets extremely that a previous engagement prevents his accepting Mr. and Mrs. Smith's kind invitation for dinner on Monday, the 10th of December. Or, Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Carey regret that they are unable to accept Mr. and Mrs. Smith's kind invitation for dinner on Monday, the 10th of December. In accepting an invitation, the day and hour must be repeated so that in case of a mistake it may be rectified and prevent one from arriving on a day when one is not expected. But in declining an invitation, it is not necessary to repeat the hour. Visiting card invitations. With the exception of invitations to house parties, dinners, and luncheons, the writing of notes is past. For an informal dance, musical, picnic, or for a tea to meet a guest, or for bridge, a lady uses her ordinary visiting card. To meet Mrs. Millicent Gifting, Mrs. John Kindheart, Tuesday, January 7th, dancing at 10 o'clock, 250 Park Avenue. Or Wednesday, January 8th, bridge at 4 o'clock, Mrs. John Kindheart, RSVP, 350 Park Avenue. Answers to invitations written on visiting cards are always formally worded in the third person, precisely as though the invitation had been engraved. Invitations in the second person. The informal dinner and luncheon invitation is not spaced according to set words on each line, but is written merely in 2 paragraphs. Example: Dear Mrs. Smith, will you and Mr. Smith dine with us on Thursday, the 7th of January at 8 o'clock? Hoping so much for the pleasure of seeing you. Very sincerely, Carolyn Robinson Town. The informal note of acceptance or regret. Dear Mrs. Town, it will give us much pleasure to dine with you on Thursday the 7th at 8 o'clock. Thanking you for your kind thought of us. Sincerely yours, Margaret Smith. Wednesday. Or, Dear Mrs. Town, my husband and I will dine with you on Thursday the 7th at 8 o'clock with greatest pleasure. Thanking you so much for thinking of us. Always sincerely, Margaret Smith. Or, Dear Mrs. Town, we are so sorry that we shall be unable to dine with you on the 7th, as we have a previous engagement. With many thanks for your kindness in thinking of us. Very sincerely, Ethel Norman. Invitation to a country house. To an intimate friend. Dear Sally, will you and Jack, and the baby and nurse, of course, come out the 28th, Friday, and stay for 10 days? Morning and evening trains take only 40 minutes, and it won't hurt Jack to commute for the weekdays between the 2 Sundays. I am sure the country will do you and the baby good, or at least it will do me good to have you here. With much love, affectionately, Ethel Norman. To the friend of one's daughter. Dear Mary, will you and Jim come on Friday the 1st for the worldly dance and stay over Sunday? Muriel asks me to tell you that Helen and Dick and also Jimmy Smith are to be here, and she particularly hopes that you will come too. The 3:20 from New York is the best train, much, though there is a 4:20 and a 5:16 in case Jim is not able to take the earlier one. Very sincerely, Alice Jones. Confirming a verbal invitation. Dear Helen, this note is merely to remind you that you and Dick are coming here for the worldly dance on the 6th. Mother is expecting you on the 3:20 train and will meet you here at the station. Affectionately, Muriel. Invitation to a house party at camp. Dear Miss Strange, will you come up here on the 6th of September and stay until the 16th? It would give us all the greatest pleasure. There is a train leaving Broadway Station at 8:03 a.m., which will get you to Dustville Junction at 5 p.m. and here in time for supper. It is only fair to warn you that the camp is very primitive. We have no luxuries, but we can make you fairly comfortable if you like an outdoor life and are not too exacting. Please do not bring a maid or any clothes that the woods or weather can ruin. You will need nothing but outdoor things: walking boots, if you care to walk, a bathing suit, if you care to swim in the lake, and something comfortable rather than smart for evening, if you care to dress for supper. But on no account bring evening or any good clothes. Hoping so much that camping appeals to you, and that we shall see you on the evening of the 6th. Very sincerely yours, Martha Kindheart. The invitation by telephone. Custom, which has altered many ways and manners, has taken away all opprobrium for the message by telephone, and with the exception of those very small minority of letter-loving hostesses, all informal invitations are sent and answered by telephone. Such messages, however, follow a prescribed form. Is this Linux 000? Will you please ask Mr. and Mrs. Smith if they will dine at Mrs. Grantham Jones next Tuesday, the 10th at 8 o'clock? Mrs. Jones' telephone number is Plaza 12-2. The answer. Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Smith regret that they will be unable to dine with Mrs. Jones on Tuesday, the 10th, as they are engaged for that evening. Or, Will you please tell Mrs. Jones that Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Smith are very sorry that they will be unable to dine with her next Tuesday, and thank her for asking them? Or, please tell Mrs. Jones that Mr. and Mrs. Huntington Smith will dine with her on Tuesday the 10th with pleasure. The formula is the same whether the invitation is to dine or lunch or to play bridge or tennis or golf or motor or go on a picnic. Will Mrs. Smith play bridge with Mrs. Grantham Jones this afternoon at the country club at 4 o'clock? Hold for the wire, please. Mrs. Jones will play bridge with pleasure at 4 o'clock. In many houses, especially where there are several grown sons or daughters, a blank form is kept in the pantry. Will blank, with M blank, on blank, the blank, at blank o'clock, blank telephone number, accept, regret. These slips are taken to whichever member of the family has been invited, who crosses off regret or accept and hands the slip back for transmission to the butler, the parlor maid, or whoever is on duty in the pantry. If Mr. Smith and Mrs. Jones are themselves telephoning, there is no long conversation, but merely, Mrs. Jones. Is that you, Mrs. Smith? Or Sarah? This is Mrs. Jones. Or Alice. Will you or your husband, or John, dine with us tomorrow at 8 o'clock? Mrs. Smith. I'm so sorry we can't. We are dining with Mabel. Or, we have people coming here. Invitations to a house party are often as not telephoned. Hello, Ethel, this is Alice. Will you and Arthur come on the 16th for over Sunday? The 16th? That's Friday. We'd love to. Will you take the 3:20 train, etc. End of chapter 11.